Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Trial Talk Live. Today's presenter is going to be Amanda Kerrigan, and Amanda's presentation is going to be on video, so I'm going to play that, and then Amanda is going to join us for questions. So my name is Nancy McDonald. I'm the moderator today. Barbara Long is our buddy today, who's going to be managing the chat line and the questions. And I think this is a very good topic, weedy gardens. We get lots of questions from people that maybe have purchased a new home and they come upon this patch and what's weeds and what's good and what do they do about it. So let's start the video and see what we actually would do about it.
Today I'm going to talk to you about rescuing a weedy garden. In addition to being a master gardener, I'm also a gardener for a landscaping company, and over the years I have seen many weedy and neglected gardens. In some cases, it's been difficult to find the garden for all of the weeds and grasses and trees that have grown up in them. It's not really that uncommon. It's something that happens. So often you get something that looks like this, which is a garden from earlier this year, where you can see there are plants in there, but where is the garden exactly and what is it supposed to look like? And it can happen for different reasons. It could be just, some life happened and the garden got away from you. It could be you moved to a new house and the last people there were clearly not gardeners. It could be that you're helping out a friend who doesn't know how to start. I will say that it's entirely possible to clean and renovate, almost any degree of weedy garden. It just takes time and effort. If you have the choice, the best time to do it is sort of early summerish, which means you can see the plants there. The weeds are not huge, and hopefully they haven't gone to seed yet, so you're not starting a new generation of them. If you do it after the bulbs sort of finish, then it's easier to tell the difference between grass in the garden and small bulbs like scilla in the garden. And if you can do it on a day that's fairly dry and not too wet, it will be easier for you and for the plants. So everyone knows that, if you're cleaning out a garden, basically you have to remove the weeds and keep the plants you want to keep. What I'm going to talk about is kind of the strategy that we use when we're going into a garden like this and cleaning it up. Because I found it's very hard in photographs to sort of show how this is going to work, I've kind of made a bit of a diagram. So this is, an aerial view of your quote unquote garden, where your green things are weeds and your colored things are plants, and then brown for the soil. So the first thing that you want to do going into something like this is to take stock and go, can you see plants or things that you recognize as plants you want to keep? In this case, okay, you've got plants here and plants here and plants here. The other thing you want to look at is there an obvious edge to the garden? So is it just the garden kind of fades into the lawn and someone's been mowing around what's a garden, or is there a brick edge or a plastic edge installed in there? And also to look at what kinds of weeds are you looking at, because that's going to influence how difficult this job is going to be and how you're going to tackle it in a way. So are you looking at grass? Are you looking at trees? Are there perennial weeds? Is it mostly smaller annuals? And then of course, the next thing that you have to do is, gather your tools and get to work. Really, you just need basic tools for this. So an edger, if you're going to need to cut an edge on the garden. A hoe is a good idea to cut down any weeds that are too small or that you miss working by hand. Shovel for large weeds, and also if you have a large assembly of weeds where there's nothing you want to keep in there and you can just loosen the whole chunk with a shovel. Pruners are definitely a good idea to have, not only for pruning and cutting down, say, woody plants in there, but also in some cases for large perennial weeds. It's easier to dig them out if you get rid of the top growth first, especially in the case of something like a burdock that is producing burrs. And if there are also, larger woody weeds, you may want to have a saw and or loppers to work on getting that cut down or taken out. And you will also want a garden knife or a trowel. My personal favorites are the hori-hori style knives, which are basically like a shallow trowel with a notch at the tip for taprooted weeds and a serrated edge for cutting things. You can do just about anything with those knives. You're also going to want, a smallish bucket or trug to take with you as you move into the garden, and knee pads or a kneeler of some form, because you're going to be spending plenty of time down there, figuring out which bits are plants and which ones are weeds. Knee pads are my preference because they move with you rather than having to get up and move the kneeler, and because it's easier to find space for a knee pad than a kneeler sometimes. You will have to have a disposal plan worked out for all of these weeds. So do you have a compost pile, or are you going to have to bag them? Oops. And the other thing to do is, if you need to cut the edge, this is something to do first before you start weeding. The reason for that is that when you're on the ground, it's actually sometimes difficult to tell where you should stop weeding. Whereas if you cut the edge first, you will know where to stop when you're on the ground, and you can cut a nice shape to the garden when you stand up and, do that first. Once you have everything there, then your next step is the actual weeding, and there is really no magic solution to this. You're going to have to get down there and dig the weeds out. In a very messy garden like this, really the best thing to do is work front to back or edges towards the middle, so that you're working in the cleared space and towards the still filled space, so you're not risking stepping on good plants as easily or missing weeds. As you dig things out, and you want to dig out as much of the root as possible, pay attention to those roots as well, because some of them will be running roots or tap roots and things that will have the potential to come back later and make your life more difficult. I'll get into that a little more in the next slide. There are a lot of different plants and weeds out there, and if you don't know whether it's a weed and you can't decide whether to pull it out, it's okay to skip it and come back later. Sometimes when you stand up later and step back and take a look, you'll be able to tell better whether it's something that's supposed to be there. The flip side of that is, if you have something that you know is a good plant, like say a peony bush, then you can be pretty sure that anything that's under and inside that is not things you're going to want to keep, so you can clear that. In the case of a garden that hasn't been taken care of for a while, you may also have good plants that are not weeds, but that have been spreading or reseeding themselves all over the place. So you're going to want to limit that in most cases. For me, usually, if you're doing a good clear out, you can probably get rid of almost anything that is a smaller seedling, because if the parent plant is there and you do want some of those, it will reseed again. That's pretty obvious. In some cases of plants that were spreading, they may have spread into each other, or you may have two things that are really mixed together and you're not sure which one was actually supposed to be there. You can do the same thing as with the unknown plants and just leave that if you want and step back later and take a look. And from there, you may be able to decide which of the plants in that space you want to keep. I mentioned, some of the weeds can be a bit more of a problem. So creeping campanula, goutweed, and couchgrass are all very good examples of things that have roots that run around under the ground, will come up inside your good plants, and any bits of root you leave in are likely to resprout on you. If it's really bad, you may want to consider fully digging up the plant you want to keep, cleaning the soil and the plant's roots of all of the weed roots, and then replanting it. Your alternative is that you're going to be basically reweeding those weeds over a fairly long period of time. They will eventually go away if you just keep going at it and weakening them, but that means going in every time you see them come up and not letting them get a hold again. If you're looking at bigger things like trees, if you can, dig them out all the way. If they're too big to dig, you may be able to borrow something called a weed wrench, which can increase your leverage and help you pull things out. Or you may be able to dig around the tree and saw out as much as you can below the surface. In that case, you may also have suckers from the remaining roots coming back later, which you'll have to keep cutting or pulling until they're exhausted. The third type of weeds that could be a problem, especially if it's a garden that you're not acquainted with, is that there are a few things out there that, will cause blisters or rashes. So wild parsnip, poison ivy, and stinging nettle are pretty much the only ones you're going to find around here. But know how to recognize those three and, take precautions. So, wear your gloves, wear pants, wash off after you're finished working, especially if you're not sure that you recognize them. After you've done a section of the garden or the whole garden, depending on how big it is, you're probably going to want a stretch. And this is a good time to step back and analyze what you've done so far and see if you can figure out what more might need to be done. So at this point, you might be able to see better that, some of the things that you left that were unknown are probably more likely to be weeds, like this guy here, because nobody would have planted that there, logically speaking. You may also be able to see that, maybe based on the structure of the garden, that this is probably a reseed from something, so you can decide to get rid of that. You may also end up with plants that need rearranging or dividing to kind of rebalance the garden, and you can decide whether you want to do that at this point. And if there are shrubs in the garden, it's now probably easier to see whether they need some cleaning or pruning and trimming. And now that you have space, it will also be easier to do that. The last thing that you might want to do before you take a break is give the garden some water. You've been trampling all over the place. Things probably look a little bit tired. A lot of roots have gotten disturbed, whether you want them to or not. So giving them a drink is going to make them much happier plants. At this point, you probably also deserve a drink and a break, and you can step back and admire the work that you've done. Once you've got it down to, fully cleaned and you've taken out all of the things that you don't want and things have been more or less rebalanced, the next step is monitoring and maintaining the garden. And this is really important because you don't want it to backslide back to what it was when you arrived. So that means regular weeding to control any weeds that sprout or any new ones that come in. It doesn't take a lot of work if you do it regularly. You just go in with a hoe and, whack everything down or try to dig out as much root as you can, again, in the case of some of the difficult weeds. It will help if you can put a good coat of mulch on the garden, which will help conserve moisture and discourage some of the new weeds and also discourage some of the old ones from resprouting a bit. My personal favorite is actually a composted pine mulch or something similar because it looks a lot like dirt and it's easy to work in. If you're going to be weeding things again, what will happen if you have nice shiny red mulch or something is it's going to get kind of messy looking very quickly if you're constantly in there having to weed things, whereas it doesn't show as much in things that are, a dirt colored mulch, so to speak. At this point, you may also want to add some new plants to fill in gaps as you sort of, look at the garden over time and decide whether it needs something new. So what do you get after weeding? And in the case of this garden, this is what it looked like at the end of the day. So you can see there was a lot in there that wasn't supposed to be there, but now it's a lot cleaner and will be a lot easier to weed and maintain if it's done regularly. So in summary, if you're going in and cleaning out a weedy garden, the first thing to do is find or define the edge of the garden so you know where you're starting and ending your work. Get rid of anything you know needs to be gotten rid of, and clear around anything you know you need to keep. Pay attention to the root types of the weeds that you're taking out and try to get as much root as you can. And also pay attention to any plants that could be harmful as you're doing that. When you've finished the garden, or even a section of the garden, depending on how big it is, step back and take a look at what else you might need to do, adding or removing things to rebalance the look in the garden, and then continue to monitor and maintain the garden. Any questions?
So hi, everybody. It's Barbara here. There are some questions. So I just first wanted to make sure that we're connected with Amanda. So Amanda, could you acknowledge that you can hear me?
I can hear you. I got
Hi. Great.
blood done just in time for the whole presentation. So excellent.
Fabulous. Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Amanda, for the presentation. I had some questions myself, but since there are questions from our listeners or viewers, I'm going to start with those. So from the chat, working backwards here, someone's asking about grass that she finds in clumps of creeping phlox. So can you suggest a good way for her to remove that grass from the clumps of creeping phlox?
I don't know why grass likes the creeping phlox so much. That's the time of the sedum, right? Like it's always in the ground covers. I've gone in there with sort of like a narrow digging tool and kind of worked in and under, because creeping phlox isn't really attached all the way often if it's a big clump. So you can kind of sometimes lift it up and get a lot of the grass just around the edges, as it were. If it's really bad, you could do also what I suggested, just like dig up the whole thing, pick the grass out and put it back. But an older clump doesn't always transplant that well. So if it is an older clump, you might be better off doing it just repeatedly and trying to get the roots each time, sort of through the gaps in the phlox.
Great. Well, those are some good suggestions. So how about violets? Violets like to pop up everywhere. So is there a good way to get rid of them if you don't want them everywhere?
You just have to keep digging those out. I mean, and you have to make sure you get the root, which is like the core of it. If you really don't want the violets, because they reseed very prolifically, and whether or not they get pollinated, sometimes you just have to not have any violets at all. It's like all or nothing. But if you catch them while they're small, you can usually just hoe them out.
Okay, great. So now this is a question. I'm going to read this question. It said, if you loosen the soil around a taproot and get all but the tip of the root out, i.e. 6 to 8 inches of the root removed, will it grow back again?
What kind of plant did it say?
The questioner doesn't say. Now, 6 or 8 inches might be a dandelion. I think that would...
pretty long for a dandelion.
Example, yeah.
Yeah. If you get all but the tip, it might take quite a while for it to come back, or it won't come back. Kind of going to depend on the root. Like if it's a burdock, you might have it coming back because those have massive roots. So that is going to depend a little bit on the weed itself, but it's going to be weaker when it comes back. So then you just have to keep working.
Okay. So another question we have here is using a hoe. And when is it more efficient to use a hoe than by pulling by hand? And she's looking for technique tips. with the hoe. So can you speak about using a hoe, Amanda?
Okay, well, I mean, there are different types of hoes. Like generally the idea of a hoe is to cut below the surface or kind of like hook the weeds out of the ground a bit. Either the loop hoe / shuffle hoe or one of the diamond bladed ones, like that's a very thin, narrow, flat blade, tends to be the most maneuverable as far as I'm concerned. So those are probably the best types to use. You just have to make sure it is one that you can get under the soil, as it were, a little bit and work on that. Besides that, I guess it's practice. Like it's just back and forth motion with the blade, just under the soil to get it. I don't know how much more you can go on technique for that. When it would be more efficient is if you've got a lot of quite small weeds, especially annual ones. Depending on the type of weed, you may want to try and pick up the debris after, but sometimes it's a lot faster to clear an area of small stuff rather than doing it by hand. If it is fairly substantial tap-rooted stuff or things with, bigger roots, it's probably just better to pull them by hand because you are going to put a fair amount of effort into the hoeing.
Hey, now Nancy, did you have a question when we started earlier? You were thinking you might have a question to ask Amanda, do you? Because we've answered the ones in the chat right now.
Well, I know you were mentioning for certain types of weeds, digging up needing to dig up the entire plant and make sure there's no weeds around the roots. And I was thinking in particular about bindweed. We do get a lot of questions about bindweed in gardens, and it's so hard to get rid of. Do you have any extra tips?
Well, that one, if you can follow the roots all the way or as much as possible, that's definitely one to do it with because, yeah, it can be rather pernicious. I will say that if you keep digging out as much as you can or cutting it below the surface, a lot of the things like bindweed or horsetail is another one that's like that. They will eventually get weaker and go away. It is going to take you a couple of years because I know we did have a garden the first year I was working for this company that had a lot of bindweed, and we just kept digging out as much as we could every time we went, and it took, I think, like 2 seasons. And then, you see 1 or 2, but it's not bad. So really that's just, get as much as the root as you can every time you can, and they'll get smaller and they'll go away.
Good advice. Good advice. So there's another question here from Catherine in the chat. It's is early to mid-fall a good time to do a major overhaul to remove crabgrass and other weeds? So we're coming up to the fall now. So this listener is asking if it's a good time to do a major overhaul.
I'm going to say, like I said, best time's early-ish summer, but the next best time is now. So absolutely go ahead and do the overhaul. But once you're getting later in the season like this, you may see that a bunch of the weeds have already dropped seed for the season. So you're probably going to be having to do this again, hopefully less intensely come next season. So, go ahead and do it because it is going to help, but it'll be maybe a little more work next year than it would have been if you'd done it earlier in the summer.
Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. We've got 2 more questions, so I think that'll be it, and then we'll sign off. Here's another one. This is about Virginia creeper. So have you any tips for getting rid of Virginia creeper?
Sometimes that depends on how old it is, right? Like that one you would almost have to treat as a woody plant, like trying to get under there and dig out or cut out as much of the root as possible because a bigger one can be pretty tough to get. So if at all possible, that you want to treat like a tree and just, dig out around it and remove as much as you can.
Okay, and the last question is from Iris, and Iris is asking this question: will the weeds just grow back after leaving them on top of the soil after using the hoe? Does the weed grow back after hoeing under the surface? So there are 2 questions there, I think,
Okay, so that is absolutely going to depend on the type of weed you have. If you've got some of the smaller things like, say, lamb's quarters or clearweed, like annual stuff that's basically seedlings, not a problem. Like that, especially if you do it on a good sunny day, like, yeah, leave them on top, they'll wither up. One place, and I have the perfect example of this because that's what I spent the morning doing. One place not to do this with or not to rototill is if you have purslane, because purslane and some of the more succulent things like sedums, if you hoe them and leave them on top, they're going to resprout and grow. And any like leaves or bits that you leave in there are going to resprout and grow. So that's definitely, those aren't a hoe job. Those are, you go in and you dig it and you pick out every bit that you can.
Okay, so I think we can finish off now. I want to just put in a tip about dog strangling vine, though, personally, because right now it's setting those seed pods,
Yes.
which will explode soon. And dog strangling vine is an extremely invasive species, which we need to control. So that's something I wanted to just look up information about dog strangling vine. If you have it in your garden, please, please, please do your very best to get rid of it before it self-seeds again. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if you can't get all of the roots right now, please,
Yeah.
please, at least take off the tops and the pods and, dispose of them somewhere where they're not going to explode, so that at least you're not increasing the population.
Yeah. Not into your compost, not into your compost for sure. Anyway, thanks so much, Amanda, and coming remotely as you are. It's worked out well, a little bit of a different way to deliver a talk, but it was great. So thanks so much for coming, everybody.
Right. Well, and, thanks very much.
I'm just going to say thank you again to Amanda. And boy, to have someone who works in the industry telling us things about weeds and how to clean up our gardens, it's just it's wonderful. So next Wednesday, join us. It's going to be Judith Cox, and the topic is introducing light and magic. Doesn't that sound enticing? Bye-bye.